Everyone, so it's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to start by introducing our panelists and then sort of giving a brief introduction about why we're here and what we're going to talk about. So we have Toto Bergamo Rossi, who's the director of Venetian Heritage, Christopher Apostle, who is a board member of Save Venice and the head of the projects committee there, and Michael Gallagher, who's the head of paintings conservation at the Metropolitan Museum here in New York. So the idea of the talk was to link it to the exhibition that just opened at the Frick last week, on Tuesday, which is Veronese and Murano, two Venetian Renaissance masterpieces restored, which you see here in the slide. You see a photo of the installation. And the exhibition focuses on two works by Paolo Veronese, which come from the island of Murano and have been restored thanks to Venetian Heritage and the sponsorship of Bulgari. And the reason they're here in New York is really because of the conservation. And so when I was asked to chair a panel here and people asked me to talk about Veronese and get a group of people to talk about Veronese, I thought that the interesting angle of this exhibition is actually the conservation angle, the restoration angle, rather than just art historically talk about Veronese for an hour. And so Venice in particular is fascinating because it's such an extraordinary place in general, and the issues of conservation there are often the same as other places, but they are changed by the surrounds of the city, by specific problems to do with the city. But also it's a city where so much is still in its original context. And so these two pictures are not in fact in the church for which they were painted. They moved locations at least twice, but they're still on the same island for which they were painted. They've been in the church they're in now for the last 200 years. And they will go back to this church. And the curious thing is that, for example, the painting on the left has never left Murano before, as far as we know. I mean, this is the first time it leaves the island. And the other one only left once in 1939 for an exhibition in Venice, so that's as far as it went. So this is the sort of American debut, really the international debut of these pictures in a way. But when you think about that, you think about these pictures having been in the same place for the last 500 years, effectively. The three churches in which they've been are all walking distance from one another, like 2 minutes from one another. So the other thing about Venice that is very interesting is the presence of international committees that deal with the safeguarding, the restoration, conservation projects in Venice. And so I thought obviously Toto is here as a representative of Venetian Heritage, and they were very involved with these specific paintings. But I asked for Christopher to be here as well, because obviously Save Venice is working on similar projects, and we thought that we would focus on Veronese projects in Venice at the moment, but of course we will talk about much broader issues as well. And who better to have than Michael, who, as the head of paintings conservation at the Met, has thought about many of these issues over many years and has dealt with different challenges and situations in restoring paintings. So I would like to start with Toto, and he will explain a bit what Venetian Heritage does, and then talk in more detail about this project and the conservation of these two paintings, which happened over the last 2 years, year and a half, 2 years.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Xavier, for inviting me, and it's an amazing occasion with all beautiful things that we have around the fair. And I'm very proud to promote my Venetian art. Venetian Heritage was born in 1999 after we were together with Venetian Heritage, and it was like a diaspora, but now we are friends together again. And our goal is to promote Venetian art through restoration, study, scholarship. But not only Venice, we are very ambitious. We work in all Croatian coast, in the Greek island, and in the region of Veneto. I mean, we try to take care about Venetian heritage in the whole map of the Venetian Republic. And not only through restoration, but also through scholarship, study, and even political things, like fighting against the big ships, or try to give an order about number of tourists every year. So we try to be also political too, because now it's not about only conservation, but with the globalization in Venice last year, we have 26 million of tourists. and we are only 54,000 residents. So it's a time to taking care not only about Veronese, but also to discuss about other projects. So we try to do both. I don't know if I'm going to survive for long, but I'm trying to do it. In this case, we choose the two Veronese because I noticed them. I was an art restorer until 5 years ago, and I was up on the scaffolding in the church of San Pietro in Murano, and it was 91, and I remember going up to the scaffolding, I saw those pictures, and normally they are hang like those. I mean, they're quite high on the wall of the church of San Pietro Martire. And I remember I was watching San Jerome, and it was completely dark and green, like to watching him through a glass of the bottle, of the, the kind of color of the bottle of wine when it's very green and you saw through, and like a ribbon. And so I remember watching them, and I say to myself, look, they are really beautiful, but at that time I have no time to taking care of. And recently, 2 years ago, they asked me, and one of our corporate sponsors is Bulgari, and they asked me, well, do you have a project like not very expensive, but very, beautiful about a big Venetian masters? And I say, well, I saw something 20 years ago in Murano. And so we went there, we built the scaffolding, we took them down, and finally they make the first samples of cleaning, and we saw that kind of quality. And so we adopted the project. And I really believe that when you have those kind of objects, they don't have a lot of, let's say, of conservation problem because they paint on canvases, so they can travel. And we always try, as Venetian Heritage, to promote Venetian art, not only because we restore that, but just to make the people know about it, to give access to that. And this is why when we restore and adopt movable works of art, we always try to make them travel. So we have done an exhibition not only in Venice about our restoration, but in Berlin, in Rome, in Zagreb, and now in New York. In this case, because it was Veronese and because Xavier organized this huge exhibition a few years ago in London, as the most expert of Veronese, we started by chance to talk about come to the laboratory, come to see them, and let me know what you think about it. Also, because some of the Venetian was like taking care in the attribution of San Girolamo, but not at all about the other paintings. So maybe you can show.
And I should also add that when I did my exhibition in London in 2014, this picture was, the St. Jerome was very much on my radar, and I thought about borrowing it. But of course, what happened was that, the condition of the picture, I mean, it was filthy, it was in this remote church in Murano, and, there was no money to restore it at the time as part of the exhibition budget. And, the Curia of Venice, who is in charge of all the churches of Venice and everything that's in them, which is about 250 churches, something like that. I mean, and it's one person who deals with 250 churches.
And not easy.
Sorry?
And not an easy one.
Yeah, not an easy person either. But I was told that basically I had the rights to have one altarpiece from a church in Venice for the exhibition. So it was pretty tough when you have to think for your exhibition of, which Veronese altarpiece out of the 250 churches of Venice are you going to pick. So I ended up picking a different one. And so this was always a bit of a sort of, thorn in my side in the sense that I always thought of it as the picture that should have been in the show, but never was. So when Toto told me that they were working on it, of course, I got incredibly excited and thought, oh, this is fantastic. And I first went to the studio, to the restoration studio. I think they just started more or less. So over the last about year and a half, followed the various stages. And so here you see the before and after. And it's also worth pointing out that they restored not only the painting, but also the frames, which are pretty spectacular. So if we can have the next, it shows the second painting, the St. Agatha in prison. And again, you get to see the difference, quite drastic difference between the two. And if we keep going, there is a detail, I think a cleaning detail of the St. Jerome. No, sorry, this is also during and after. So that shows the painting in the so-called strip state. Maybe Michael can explain what a strip state is briefly.
Strip state is actually not a favorite phrase of mine. I often see clean state. Stripped always sounds like the door of your dining room. But the reason people say that, it means it's cleared of discolored overpaint and discolored varnish. And so what you're seeing is the paint layer, usually at this point perhaps a little undersaturated, it's not got its final varnish. And the little white areas will be areas of filling or stucco where there are actual paint losses. So it's a kind of moment that's often beloved of art historians and conservators, because you actually can get a sense of the overall condition. And what I would say, just from as an outsider here, is this is a picture in fantastic condition. Always imagine taking that loss, all those little losses, down to a corner of the picture, and it puts in mind what a small percentage you're talking about. It has a visual impact that is disproportionate when you look at it. It's like a sort of visual white noise. But in fact, it's really very, very, for painting of this age that's been in a church environment, it's in great condition.
So, I mean, we'll talk more about that in a bit, but I think, again, the issue of what restoration, conservation does, people judge something as, you see an incredibly dirty picture and you say, well, that's a wreck. Well, actually, it could be a picture, like in this case, that it's in fantastic condition, but it's just dirty. So, what you have to do to it is something that has to be obviously assessed to begin with. So if we go to the next slide, we have, I think, a detail showing part of the sky of the St. Jerome. And here you see the little rectangle, of course, it's the clean part, while around it you see the dirt, the degraded varnish, everything else that's been on top of this picture for quite a while. In fact, the picture had previous restoration campaigns, but not for a while.
Yeah, I think the last one was probably in the 60s for San Jerome, but not for Santa Agata. Probably Santa Agata was, let's say, restore or maintenance problem during the time when they moved it from one church to the others, because Xavier probably will talk about that. They were in the little chapel built, made for a little chapel for this Francesco degli Albori in the middle of 16th century, and after the end of 17th century they moved to another church, and at that time they have done the Baroque, let's say, in the Roman style frame. And during Napoleon time, they were like, let's say, park on the church of St. Peter. So they have been, they have quite a tormented story. And we know that in the 60s they have done some maintenance of San Girolamo and not of Sant'Agata. But you have a lot of layers of wrong kind of treatment of like a varnish. And that kind of varnish, normally with time, they get oxidated and they turn in that kind of green, dark green colors. And it's true that as you said, in any case, after the first cleaning, when they removed the varnish, we were quite surprised about, let's say, that 90% of the, maybe more, 95% of the surface was almost intact. And this was you never know when you start to take out the old restoration how much is going to stay or not. And in this case, we were like very, it was a nice surprise to do it.
If we go to the next slide, you see another similar detail of I think the drapery of the St. Jerome. Again, so the part, you see a part that has been cleaned and a part that is so in this case it's actually the other way around. The central part is still dirty and everything around it has been cleaned. So you see the difference that the yellowed varnish made in this case. But otherwise the paint surface in this specific painting was fairly intact. As Toto mentioned, the pictures moved 3 times. They moved to 3 different locations. So in this case, we're not talking about pictures that are in the original location for which they were intended. The original location was a small chapel that was built between 1566, 1567, but it was demolished in the 1830s. And in fact, what happened is that the pictures had already left the chapel much earlier in the 1660s, 1667. So they were in the original location for about 100 years. And what I find fascinating is that when they were moved in 1667, they were moved for conservation reasons, mainly. So what happened was that this little chapel stood in the cemetery of the nuns of Santa Maria degli Angeli, which is a big church in Murano. And the priest had asked for a piece of land to be given to him there so that he could build this chapel dedicated to St. Jerome, and he asked Veronese to paint these two pictures. The St. Jerome was over the altar, the St. Agatha was on the counter facade over the door. So you have to imagine a fairly small, probably brick structure with these two fairly large paintings in it, so it must have been a pretty spectacular sight. But when he dies, he leaves a very interesting will in which he asks specifically for his family not to be involved with this chapel ever. He must have had a very weird relationship with his family. He leaves things to his two nephews who are both priests as well, so I'm not quite sure that there seemed to have been a tradition in the family of people becoming priests, monks, and so on. And he also leaves money for dowry for a niece, and he says in the will, whose name I do not remember, and I'm sure this niece was really happy about this.
Very, very Italian.
Yeah, very Italian. But he leaves everything to the nuns with the idea that 2 nuns at a time will invest his money to keep the chapel going. And of course, as soon as he dies, the family, including the niece whose name he didn't remember, sue the nuns to get the money back. And they fail. I mean, the nuns keep the money. But there is this idea that 2 nuns are constantly in charge of the chapel, so they have to pay out of his money, out of this endowment, effectively, for the upkeep of the chapel. But in 1667, these nuns decide that they're worried about what's going on in the chapel, and they say that the paintings are deteriorating. And, we don't know what they mean by that. Is the varnish already yellowing? Are they dirty? Is there a humidity problem? I mean, we don't know. But they moved them into the main church of Santa Maria degli Angeli. And around this time is probably when the fabulous frames are made. Those are not the original frames, but they're made in the late 17th century. Subsequently, when the church gets suppressed, the nunnery and the church get suppressed with the Napoleonic Wars in, sort of early 19th century, so around 1810, 1815, there is a decision to demolish the church and the nunnery of Santa Maria degli Angeli. And what happens is that the convent is effectively destroyed. The church, for miraculous reasons, remains. It's transformed into all sorts of things, sort of factory at one point and various things. And it's finally, half of it is restored back to a church in fairly recent times. But with the idea of demolishing the church, they have to preserve the pictures, and so they're moved yet to another church, which is just, as I said, a few yards away from Santa Maria degli Angeli. So in this case, we're not talking about original context for the pictures in the sense of somewhere they were intended for, but we're still talking about a place where they've been for 200 years and very close to where they were painted for. So you're still dealing with a historical sort of scenario, historical setting, which has issues that obviously a museum with climate control and security and all those things has. The other thing that is said at the time when the pictures are moved is that there had been attempts at stealing the pictures in 1667. So clearly this little chapel in this cemetery is problematic because also they're worried about safety. While the church is clearly well safeguarded, the little chapel isn't. So the idea of the original location brings me to the next slide, and I will ask Christopher to talk a bit, first of all, a little bit about, say, Venice, and explain also what, say, Venice does, but also going to another great place to do with Veronese, a place in which actually everything is in the original context.
Thanks very much. First, I'd like to congratulate Toto for a great restoration. I think it's wonderful, and it's a gift to New York. So if you haven't been yet to see the Veroneses, run over to the Frick. It's a wonderful thing. Like Venetian heritage, say Venice tries to promote Venetian art. We focus more actually on the core of the Venetian Empire itself, mostly in the city of Venice and the surrounding islands. But the mission is absolutely aligned, getting Venetian art out in front of a wider public, and having a pair of Veroneses like this in New York is a great event. Say Venice was founded in 1971 by 3 Americans in response to the flooding in 1966 in Venice and in Florence. I think it's finally when the world woke up to the fact that these artistic treasures in Italy, first of all, Italy has so many that it's not fair to expect them to be the sole guardians, and it was realized that we as humanity have to help the stewardship of those works of art, and how fragile some of these great treasure cities of the world are. And Venice, of course, as Xavier said, is particularly precarious, one would say, more than almost any city. I mean, the Tiber runs through Rome, the Arno runs through Florence, but, water and Venice have a totally different relationship. And water is, as those of you know who are collectors or, who love art, it's not the best friend of art of any kind. So Venice is a very specific case. We had a slide earlier, and we don't need to go back. It just shows you the outside of the Church of San Sebastiano. And I think it's quite true that you can't talk about Veronese without talking about San Sebastiano. It is his church. It is as much his place as the Sistine Chapel belongs to Michelangelo. He is even buried there, so there's just no discussing Veronese without discussing this church. It represents, I suppose, his artistic output in a microcosm, in a sense. It is, we have very early works. He started working there in 1555 and continues to about 1570, although the end date, I mean, I know you have the final date maybe moving around a bit, but let's say for 15 years he works there, and he does everything. He designs, this is a good view, actually. It shows you the whole church in a nutshell, but he designs the altarpiece around in the far back past the scaffolding in the presbytery. You see a stone surround. He designs that. He designs supposedly the flooring in there. He changes the windows there. He designs the organ, which you can't see, which is on the left behind the scaffolding. He paints the ceiling. He designs the coffered ceiling you see there, and he paints all the frescoes. So it's really an entire holistic vision through many years of Veronese. And it's also, fortunately, fairly well documented for Veronese, who doesn't always have a lot of pieces of paper attached to work, so it allows, and in fact, I think the Murano project has some documents. We know he found them. Okay, well, there you go. But that also supplies a lot of information. So I'll just, maybe if we go to the next slide. As I said, he painted the ceiling in the sacristy in 1555. He was commissioned by a fellow Veronese prior of the church, a fellow called Bernardo Torioli, who must have known his work in Verona. And he had only arrived in Venice a few years before. Veronese had only arrived a few years before. And he gets him to paint the sacristy, which is a little bit out of the public view, and was so successful he almost immediately commissions this ceiling, which is one of the great glories, I would say, of Venice. It depicts stories from the tale of Esther, and there are three large canvases you see on the left of the repudiation of Vashti. The middle is the coronation of Esther, and finally the triumph of Mordecai on the right. As I said, Veronese and probably two and maybe a few more assistants painted this. The canvases are largely Veronese, I would say, and then the surrounds work with Fasolo, I suppose, and Benedetto Cagliari, his brother. But they did this in I think even less than a year. So it was a very quick work. If you go to the next slide, this shows you one of the first bits we tackled. After doing in 2007 a full screening of the church, and you were talking about what sort of environmental things we looked at. There was humidity, there was rising damp. These are things you have to think about a lot in Venice. This just shows you some of what we were dealing with. This is the coronation of Esther, the central canvas. And you see there were layers taken off. This is a wonderful slide. It shows you in the upper left corner a layer of overpaint over the sky, over the entire sky that went around the figures, around the architecture, added in the 1830s by a restorer who simply thought that the sky had become quite dark. And of course, the reason it's become quite dark is in this particular case, the artist was using a color Smalt, which almost always gets, maybe you can talk a bit about Smalt, actually.
Smalt is it's a pigment, but it's a cobalt glass, and it has a very sort of ancient provenance, but it became incredibly popular as partly because it was a cost-effective substitute for much more expensive blue pigments, particularly ultramarine, but also azurite. But I think you also can't rule out, and you can sort of see there in that little slide on the right, it's a beautiful color. So I think artists both chose it to save money sometimes, or because there wasn't the money in the commission to buy ultramarine. But there are examples, I believe, also in Veronese, where there is evidence of the use of smalt for commissions that were actually, important commissions. So he possibly just liked the color. But over time, the color leaches out. It interacts with the acidity in the medium, and it can entirely lose its color. If you look at microscopically, what you often see is a glassy-looking, kind of like almost like a little piece of glass. And sometimes the only blue that is left is right in the center of the particle. So what happens as that loses its color, what becomes dominant is the discolored medium of the oil. So if, depending on what underlayers are there or what layers have been put on top, you may end up with almost like a colorless, much, much warmer toned area than was ever intended. If, for example, if an ultramarine was used over the top or another stronger blue, if it's mixed with other colors, that can be different. But it does lose its color. But curiously, that is dependent on issues of acidity, moisture. So artists probably saw some examples where it hadn't discolored so much. But I think they were probably also seduced just by the color.
We should, we should talk about this issue of the blue, because with Veronese, it's a very important one. There are basically three ways of painting blue at this point in Italy. Ultramarine, which is crushed lapis lazuli mixed then with a medium. And lapis lazuli, as you probably know, all come from one single quarry in Afghanistan. So getting hold of it was not cheap, and lapis lazuli was often as, if not more expensive than gold at this point in Italy. There's then azurite, which is a mineral pigment which comes from mostly Eastern Europe, Hungary. The only problem with azurite is that it's a sort of slightly greener blue. So there are times when you can have very high quality azurite and it looks just like ultramarine, but it tends to go slightly greener. And then smalt, which is really a byproduct of the glass industry. And so in Venice, it's hugely popular, hugely cheap. And when you use it to begin with, it has the same exact intensity as ultramarine. So you can clearly understand that many patrons or painters would decide to use smalt rather than ultramarine because the effect was the same and the cost was hugely lower. I sometimes even wonder that there are cases, not with Veronese, but with other painters, where the contract specifies that ultramarine has to be used, and then you find that they actually use smalt, so they probably run off with the money or actually the ultramarine. But with Veronese, we've done a lot of analysis on the skies, and he used a variety of things. So he used all three of these pigments. He often used them all together. So the two allegories at the Frick, we analyzed at the Met 10 years ago now. And you look at the skies in those two pictures, they look exactly the same. But it turns out that different combinations of pigments. So one is a combination of azurite and ultramarine. The other one is a combination of smalt, azurite, and ultramarine layered on top of each other. So they're very different. They look the same, but they're actually composed in a different way. The change in smalt, it's something that happens over a period of time, and we clearly think that Veronese didn't know this was going to happen. He probably wouldn't have used the pigment if he knew this would happen. And so when it tends to go gray, brownish over time, the first evidence I found is there is a biographer of Veronese about 60 years after he dies, who already writes that there is a problem with blues in some of Veronese's paintings, but he says it's restorers who don't know how to deal with those blues. He suggests that it's restorers who are doing something wrong, and that's why the blue goes wrong. So clearly they didn't understand what it was. And in fact, this whole shift in smalt is something that technically, scientifically has been studied in fairly recent times. It's really over the last 15, 20 years that we really understand it. So you will read a lot of books on Veronese from the last 50 years, which always talk about these wonderful pearly gray skies in Veronese paintings because the colors of the figures are in such wonderful contrast against these gray skies, which is what you see here. You see the colors of the figures and the gray sky. In fact, it's just a discolored smalt, and those skies would have been blue skies. With the St. Jerome and the St. Agatha, we were lucky because he doesn't seem to have used smalt in the sky, or if he did, it was part of a combination where the other pigments were stronger and more present and kept in a better shape. We don't know because we didn't take any samples, so we don't know scientifically what those skies are composed of. I mean, looking at them, I would suspect there is ultramarine in them because the blue is so intense. But if you go to the Frick and look at the pictures, in the St. Agatha, notice the St. Peter on the right, and his lower dress, the skirt, is a weird grayish, brownish, and that is Smalt. So that would have been an intense blue garment that now has deteriorated. And the poor St. Peter actually also has a sort of overcoat in orange, which is another very problematic color that Veronese uses, which is orpiment and realgar, which are pigments that over time become chalky and basically sort of fall off. So we discussed the good condition of a painting, but there are also certain things that are non-reversible. I mean, you can clean a picture, but when you have a pigment that has shifted and changed, you cannot do anything about it. So Christopher can talk a bit about the issue with the sky here, because that was a big issue.
This is a big issue, and in fact, it's very good that you mentioned the sort of restorers who didn't quite know what to do. You see this sort of orangey section was an early attempt in the 17th century to try to brighten up the paintings, because they were, as we've said, already beginning to go gray. And so a very sort of thick tinted layer of a very oily surface was put on varnish, and that of course became yellower and oranger and more orange until, as I said, the 1830s, when the restorer just simply decided to repaint the sky on all three. And when we went through there was a discussion when we were looking at these pictures, because they're not very easy to see, obviously. They've only been down, your paintings have only moved 3 times, and these, I think, have only been down 3 times. Once during World War I, when Venice was being bombed, we forget that, but they had to be hidden, and then twice to be relined. There was a thought of maybe just leaving the overpaint on, to be non-invasive, but it was decided to take them back. And I think if we could go to the next slides, just to show you how beautiful, how astounding, what an astounding painter he is once he's cleaned and shows the quality. Let's go ahead.
I mean, I think that the shift in color, you also have, people have to use a bit of imagination. And clearly, I think that is a shift in terms of what the artist intended, which will never go back to what it was. I mean, we just have to accept it for what it is over the last 500 years. I was shocked many years ago when I worked on my first Veronese show, The Frick. We borrowed 2 paintings from LACMA, from LA, which have degraded skies, but the degraded sky is in the corner at the top left, top right corner of these pictures, and it's just a tiny little sliver. And I just thought, as an experiment, let's use Photoshop and put a blue sky there just to see what. And honestly, I was surprised myself at how huge the difference was in how you perceive the picture, how the spatial structure in the picture works. So, with restoration, you can only go so far. I mean, there are things you can do, but you're not going to start repainting skies of a blue color. And clearly that was done in the past, but we don't do that anymore.
But look how blue those blues are, and those are lapis, so just to show you. We go to the next slide, and I'm going to speed along because I know we'll probably are going to get pressed for time. The reason we went into the church was because there was, the local priest said, there's all these blotches on the ceiling. There on the left you see a bit of the wooden surround around the ester canvases, and that was, they thought, mold. In fact, it was sort of a blanching of the varnish, where the varnish, I guess, how would you explain that, pulls away.
You could think of it as a sort of micro-delamination, so that the varnish is sort of slightly parting company with the paint layer beneath, and you're getting a sort of whitish haze. And similar things happen if you think of putting a coffee cup on a table, and the white ring you can get. It's a similar sort of idea.
Well, so we dealt with that, and as you can see, the clean painting on the right, that's painted directly on the boards of the attic above. So maybe we go to the next. Just again, as I said, he's painting in a bunch of different media here. This is the cleaning of one of the best, I think, parts of the fresco cycle, which I guess dates about 1558, 59. He's doing already the frescoes in the church. This is a set of archers on one side of the church up above in the barco, where the monks are allowed to sing. The other side shows Saint Sebastian full of arrows. So it's great sort of conversation, sort of grim conversation maybe across the church, but really wonderful chic figures. You can see there were cracks that we had to deal with, old restorations, and exactly what Xavier was talking about was that orpiment. If you look there in the central archer, all the flakes were in that sort of orpiment color, which is very, very fragile and just flaked off. We're going to talk about how sometimes Smalt works, and it works better with lots of lead white and in fresco. It seems to maintain, it's as Michael was saying, the medium has a lot to do with it. So I think that as we've been saying, these artists themselves wouldn't have quite understood immediately, how the materials would age. And I'll just finish up with the sort of the back part of the church. Funnily enough, we restored the church over the period of 10 years, almost in exactly the order that Veronese made the church. And I don't know if that was on purpose, but it also just made sense. You think we did it on purpose, or who knows? But anyway, we followed basically his chronological steps. And this part, which we're just finishing now, this is before. In fact, we've just finished it so recently that I don't have photos that I thought were good enough to show you. But this is the presbytery, which shows the high altar, which was commissioned in, I guess it was paid for in 65, but commissioned earlier. And a show, it was commissioned by a lady called Elizabeth, who is shown, where's the Saint Elizabeth there? So she puts her patron saint in. San Sebastiano is, of course, the central figure. And you see here, as we were saying, there are, on the far right is the main altar. You see parts of the clouds actually have smalt, and then other parts of the sky have ultramarine. He's absolutely using it. In the organ loft, we actually have azurite as well. So there's a bunch of different pigments. The top and the bottom are two scenes. The lateral canvas is from the presbytery, which shows two scenes of the story of San Sebastiano. In that case, there was a different medium used in the blue, and it actually has gone to a sort of more orangey yellow, and that is something that hasn't been reversed. So if you go see them today, the colors of all the figures, and they're very well preserved, but the skies do have that grayish yellow look.
And I think this slide is also a good point to talk about. Also support, because, paintings usually are on canvas, panel, let's say wall paintings, frescoes. Those are the three broad categories. Of course, there are exceptions. There's copper, there's stone, there's other things. I may be saying something totally wrong, and Michael can correct me if I'm wrong, but in normal circumstances, true fresco and wall paintings, it's one of the most durable painted surfaces, type of paintings in the world. Surprising to think about that, but that's the way it is. It's much more stable than something on a panel or a canvas. Unless, of course, you have humidity. So Venice is the one place where fresco is never a good idea. And mostly the development of painting on canvas, on large canvases, happens in Venice because they cannot really paint in frescoes. Amazingly, they knew there was a problem, but they kept painting in frescoes. And so you have to think that most of the facades of the palaces in Venice were frescoed by Titian, by Tintoretto, by Bassano, by Veronese. And all of that is just gone. I mean, we don't have any of that outside. You just have to think, rain, the water from the canal, there's humidity coming up, the combination of the things. But in churches like San Sebastiano, it's a combination of fresco and canvas and panel. And I've always been very surprised by why Veronese painted so much in fresco there, knowing full well that there were problems with it. And in fact, there were problems because, for example, up at the Barco, at one point he was asked to substitute some of the frescoes with canvases because the frescoes were already deteriorating. And if you look at Veronese's career, there are many instances where he has to substitute his own work 5-10 years later with a canvas because the fresco had deteriorated. And there is also one puzzling time when the opposite happens. I don't know why. The canvas somehow had humidity problems, so he decides to substitute that with a fresco, and not surprising, neither of them survives. But if you look at the apse, the pre-restoration slide, you see the canvases, the lateral, the altarpiece, and then that white ceiling, apse and dome. all of that was frescoed by Veronese, and all of that is gone. And it was already gone in the 18th century. Sebastiano Ricci was asked to repaint all of that area, and he did, and that's gone also. So there's 2 campaigns of frescoes there that we've lost. We have no idea what they were like. And say Venice did analysis to try and see if there was something under the intonaco, under the wall that remains of these frescoes, but there was absolutely nothing.
No.
So clearly,
and we think there was, I mean, the Campanile fell down, so we think maybe that might have been the end. Yeah, it fell on the dome and destroy. Maybe if we go to the last slide, because part of what we were discussing was making discoveries. And this is a particularly wonderful one. This is under the dome. I don't know how many feet up off the floor would you say, 50, 60 feet? I mean, you know, it's scary. We went up there. And it's the scaffolding at the very top around the sort of oculi on either side of the presbytery. And there are 4 canvases of the four evangelists. That's normal, something totally normal. But they're very little recorded, and they're not, I don't think, recorded except in passing in older documents, and very little published, very little mentioned in the modern. I think Pignatti mentions them and a few other people, but they sort of were understudied to the point where at one point I remember people saying, well, we're not even sure they were originally here. They hadn't been looked at for a long time. By putting up the scaffolding, doing what we're doing, we got the opportunity to go up and look at these more carefully. And we could say these 2, which are Saint Mark and Saint Luke, are definitely by Veronese. The other 2, I think they're about circa 1700. Obviously on the same fitted canvas, and must have been by, I think probably the other ones could have been damaged in whatever happened to the dome. It's just a thought. But if we just go to the next slide, these were relined. They weren't really fitting in place very well. They had been relined at some point in the 20th century, but they needed doing again. Again, you know, the humidity just from the outside wall is not helpful for these things. And then finally put them back into space, into their proper place where they fit brilliantly, and are restored.
This is literally from 2 weeks ago, the slide, 3 weeks
this
ago.
Is really, really recent. This we have, this we have.
And so the relining brings up a very important structural issue in terms of restoration. So we talked about, you know, cleaning and removing dirty varnish and you know, dirty stuff on the surface of a painting. But there is, you know, when you're dealing with a canvas, there is the more important structural issue of relining. And so this is an issue that we had to confront for the St. Jerome and the St. Agatha, and it was decided that they were not going to be relined in that case. But in the case of these lunettes at San Sebastiano, they had to be relined. So Michael maybe can talk a bit about, you know, the pros and cons of relining. I mean, you know, and what relining means, because when people think about conservation and restoration, I often talk to people who think that the damage to a picture is simply how big is the hole of missing paint on that picture. Well, you could also have somewhere where the paint surface is all there, but there is very heavy damage because of relining. And so people don't really understand what is good and bad about relining and how that affects the picture. Again, like the color issue in a permanent way. You can't reverse that.
So if you've got 2 hours, we'll talk about lining. No, so lining is the process of adhering a secondary support, another fabric to the back of the original. And there are different ways of doing that, and there are different adhesives that are used. But the whole idea is reinforcement. And there was a point when that reinforcement was probably necessary. In the 19th century, it almost became, you know, de rigueur that anything that moved was lined. We have examples of pre-Raphaelite artists who, during the course of painting, sent their pictures off to be lined because it was seen as a really good thing to do. You know, most things in conservation have pendulum swings, so you have periods when pictures were readily lined. If anything was cleaned, it was automatic that the lining would be replaced. I tend to think of relining as replacing a lining, and lining being the first time it happens. We now probably fetishize an unlined picture because it's so rare, and I think rightly we do try to at all costs preserve an unlined surface, but you know, there are times when the original support has deteriorated and lining is the proper and responsible thing to do. So it's my favorite word at the moment is appropriate in all things. And so what you don't want to do is say we never or we always. You have to look at each circumstance. There are paintings I've worked on at the Metropolitan Museum where I haven't replaced the lining. The big Charles Le Brun we recently acquired, the big Henry Fane by Reynolds. I've just taken the lining off our large Moretto entombment and replaced it. And I hope all for the best reasons, but you have to enter into that decision by just looking with an open mind at the actual condition of the object, the circumstance it's going to be displayed in, scale, everything else. Lining has saved thousands of paintings for us to see. It's also, as Xavier said, heavy-handed, like most things. A bad practitioner is usually to blame rather than a process. So the flattening of the surface topography of paintings, impregnation with wax that has shifted the tone of paintings. All of those things are the fault of bad linings, but it should be, lined isn't necessarily evil. It's often was a necessary process, and sometimes it's done very, very well and was the right thing to do.
I think in the case of the St. Jerome and Agatha, we changed the stretchers. There was an issue with the stretchers, but we managed to sort of re-stretch the canvases that were strong enough. I mean, they had been relined in the past, so we are not talking about unlined pictures here.
And I should say, lining is a big intervention. So if you can avoid doing it, as the examples I gave, I would, and I think any responsible conservator would. There's just times when it's necessary.
No, absolutely. I think we go to the next slide. We get back to the St. Jerome, I think. Yeah. So I was going to ask quickly to Toto about the frames as well, because this was when you're dealing with, we talked about original context, and even at San Sebastiano, you're not just focusing on the canvases that Veronese painted, but you're focusing on everything around it, the frames, the stone structure at San Sebastiano. I mean, it's a huge job, say Venice is now also working on the facade of the church. But in this case, the decision was made to work, obviously, on the canvases and on the frames. And Toto started as an object conservator, right? Yeah. Sculpture conservator. So.
Yeah. But in this case, it's quite unique because, as Xavier explained before, they were in the chapel in the middle of 16th century, and probably in the marble stone altars, both of them, or with some stone frame. So this is why when they were moved at the end of 17th century in the main church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, they reframed with this kind of quite exceptional frame. We don't have those kind of frame in Venice in general. They're more like this, but in stucco, so they're part of the structures on the wall. We don't have those kind of wooden gilded, let's say in the Roman Baroque way, so they're quite exceptional. And because of the poor state of conservation, they were really falling apart. I mean, I remember some of the corner you put a finger in the plaster, and they were completely full of water because the Church of St. Peter in Murano, until 20 years ago, had a big problem on the roof. So the wall was completely leaking with rain water from the wall. And of course, the plaster on top of wood was completely exposed in many, many parts. So this is why they are an unicum. So we decided to adopt the restoration of the paintings and the frame too. And it's funny that the end of 17th century, there is another painting, so was in the church of Santa Maria degli Angeli by Lazzarini. It's not very well known, but he was the master of Tiepolo. And he has the same frame. So this is why a resetting of let's say, representation of the paintings in the church were done probably for more paintings, not only for the Veronese when they moved them. But that one is in better shape, so for now it's there. But it's something also nice to study that kind of things. So we have Michael Clemente, who's an expert on Baroque sculptures, that now he's studying those kind of things. And it's funny that we still discover things, because, for example, we don't have many names about wooden carver artists of the end of 17th century, and now probably we're gonna discover that kind of new, let's say, chapter of artisans or sculptors than they were in Venice at the end of 17th century.
We could clearly go on all morning talking about issues not only with Veronese but more broadly Venetian art and art paintings in general and objects. But we have exactly 6 minutes, so I don't know if there are a couple of burning questions from the public. We'd be happy to answer one, maybe 2 questions.
Hi, thank you for such a wonderful talk and congratulations on the beautiful treatments. And I just had a question. It's so wonderful to have these things in New York, and I wondered how you're going to reintroduce them into the church environment, because you've done a great job talking about preventive conservation and environmental control. And now they've been wonderfully treated in Michael's beautiful studio, and I just wondered if you're going to have any plans for, what steps you're going to take to sort of monitor and upkeep the beautiful
Just
treatments.
quickly for a point of information, I had nothing to do with the
Okay.
conservation, just because that would be I would love to
Oh,
pretend
that's
I did, but...
So
But it was all done. Sorry, that was my
They were cleaned in
misunderstanding.
Venice, so they were
Okay.
cleaned in Venice.
Beautiful job.
I can answer, yeah.
Okay.
But now the church doesn't have the same problem than 20 years ago. The roof is redone, the windows are redone, and they have almost quite a good control of the climate inside. And on the wall in front of the Veronese where they are, you have an amazing, the biggest Bellini, I think, is the presentation. The Doge Barbarigo in front of the Virgin is a huge painting, and it's there too. So I think that, let's say, not only thanks to our organization that have done a lot, but the Italian state have done really a huge work in the last 20 years about roof, foundation, and cut the humidity from the floor. So I think that now the paintings are in better shapes. And yeah, let's say that the place, they are more on control now than what it was 20 or 30 years ago.
I'm going to just add, I think we think about this question. So before they go back, we're thinking about it. In fact, we just finished a restoration of a Titian in the Frari, the Madonna di Capesaro, and it's up against a brick wall. And we've spent some time figuring out how, the humidity could be kept out. We've put this sort of, I call it the sweater on the back. There's this woolen material made in Sardinia, maybe exactly what your outfit's made out of. And that's an in-house joke. But the wool is impermeable. So I'm sure Toto and they're doing the same thing. I mean, this is a church, and you have to monitor it. You have probably hygrometers and things.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just a simple, broken glass on the windows that nobody go up and fix it for months, and you have liters of water coming in. It's just that. There's a lack of maintenance also.
I think, this is something that committees and many of us are thinking about these days. It's a very good point. There is always the idea that you get something out of a church or a place and it's filthy dirty, you clean it, it looks fabulous. It's very sexy. It's a kind of look, before, after. But then there is the issue of maintenance, and we're all struggling with that because in a place like Venice, but everywhere else, in Florence and Rome, and all over the world, you can restore something, but then you have to maintain it. And clearly you need to try and do that as you go along, and it's a huge job. They have to maintain 250 churches, plus all the palaces and everything else. So it's clearly a question of raising awareness also of that with the priests of the various churches. And I think it's something that in the last 10 years maybe, it's really shifted. And I think the committees started with a kind of emergency response to things. But now there is a sense that, as things that, there's still a lot to be done, but you can, everything that has been done also has to be maintained. So that's...
And I'd just like to throw in, I think the other thing just always to remember is just how incredibly precious it is to have art objects in, perhaps not in this case, their absolutely original setting, but as near as damn it, in the proper setting. We all love museums, we all benefit from it, but that is something that you cannot repeat in a museum setting, to go in, to see something at the right height, to come in at the right angle. So it's the right thing from a conservation point of view to think about all the issues of preservation, but I always want to say, do not think that taking something out and putting it in the perfect environment is the right thing by the object. You are diminishing an experience that makes objects relevant.
The very good example is there is another St. Jerome by Veronese, an altarpiece which was done for another church in Venice, Sant'Andrea della Zirada, and there were big issues there with conservation, with the fact that the church was always closed. So that about 15 years ago maybe, it was sent on loan to the Accademia in Venice because they thought at the time, reasonably, that it was the responsible thing to do. The picture now is at the Accademia and it looks fantastic in the museum, but I hope that one day it can go back to the church for which it was painted. And in this case, Toto and I and everyone who's worked on the project, we're all very keen for the pictures to go back to Murano. We're discussing where they will go in the church because where they were before, they were almost invisible. So there are other options, I think, in the church that we're going to study about where they can be seen. And because it is not the exact original location, they can be moved in the church. But I think it's important that they will go back there.